Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you to the Leakey Foundation for inviting me to come today to talk to you about my research. I always heard that in Texas everything is big, but wow, you guys weren't kidding. This is the biggest screen I think I've ever seen. So I'm here today to talk about new fossils that were found in North Africa and how it's changing the way we view modern human origins. I'm going to structure the talk so that I talk first about the discovery, and second about the diagnosis, and then finally about our interpretation of these fossils. So first, the discovery. The year is 1961. We're in the middle of a Cold War. John F. Kennedy is president. Roger Maris hits his 61st home run, beating Babe Ruth's previous record. And Barack Obama is born in Hawaii. And elsewhere in the world, the Pan-African Games are going on in Morocco, and that's where this story takes place. So in 1961, a fossil skull was accidentally found by miners who were excavating barite, which is something that's used in the drilling process. And this skull eventually found its way into the hands of some scientists. And they went back, and in subsequent years, they discovered additional fossils. In 1962, the original fossil skull, you can see here, was published. In 1963, a second skull was found, and in 1969, a juvenile, a child's jaw, was described. Jebel Irhoud is a hilly area about 400 kilometers, about 6-mile drive from Rabat. And although these original fossils brought a lot of attention to the area, they were quickly overshadowed by fossil finds in South Africa and in East Africa, specifically the Nutcracker Man here, the Leakeys, Mary and Louis Leakey here on the left. In the upper right-hand corner, the finds from Schwarzkranz, and in the lower right-hand corner, Don Johansen and Tim White discoveries of Lucy. And these fossils, of course, were much older than the fossils that were found in Morocco. Now, the fossils that were found in Morocco were associated with Middle Paleolithic tools, and the fauna suggested that they were somewhere between 130,000 and 700,000 years old. But you can imagine that finds in East and South Africa dating in the millions of years would overshadow that, and people quickly kind of forgot about it for a while. But one young scholar, Jean-Jacques Hublin, a graduate student at the time in the 1980s, went back and studied the fossils, and he visited the site. And he knew that one of the key things that had to be discovered about this site was an accurate date. That date would allow us to put these fossils into a larger perspective and would help elucidate modern human origins. Now, Jean-Jacques Hublin became the director of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig in 2003, and I joined his group in 2004. And it was in 2004, with the backing of the Max Planck Institute and in collaboration with colleagues in Morocco, Abdullah Ben Nasser, who's from INSAP in Morocco, the two of these men collaborated and were able to reopen the site. This is Jean-Jacques Hublin on the left and Abdullah Ben Nasser on the right. And here's the site in 2004. And one of the key things that they wanted to do when they revisited the site in 2004 was, as I mentioned, well, of course, look for new fossils, but primarily they were interested in figuring out the date. And so, and they had to figure out a better stratigraphy, trying to figure out where the original fossils were found. This slide here represents some old maps of the site, and you can imagine that, little arrows pointing here and here, the fossils, while they're about here, isn't quite as nice as we would like, right? And so they needed to go back and really take a good look at the site with using modern technology. So here is Daniel Richter, my colleague from the Max Planck Institute. In 2004, he's drilling into the rock to put in dosimeters so that they can measure the background radiation, which allows us to do dating techniques like electron spin resonance and thermoluminescence. If you know what the accumulation rate is of the electrons, then you can calculate an annual accumulation, and then you can work back and figure out how old things are. In the bottom right here is Shannon McPherron, who is a Max Planck archaeologist working with Abdullah Ben Nasser together. So this is a site in 2007. In 2004, when they went back and put the dosimeters in, they did find a couple additional fossils, a worn tooth here, a broken molar there, but they didn't hit fossil pay dirt, if you will, until 2007. And this, coincidentally, is the same year that some very interesting news was published by Max Planck colleague Tanya Smith, here featured on the upper right-hand corner, regarding the age of the child specimen, one of the original ones found in 1969, and also providing us evidence on the speed at which this individual grew, how fast their growth was. So by doing very sophisticated techniques, as you can see here, they used synchrotron X-rays to look inside the jaw and to create 3D models or 3D representations of the teeth that were inside the jaw. They were able to section teeth, and they were able to figure out the age, the exact age in days of this specimen. And then knowing the exact age of this specimen, they could then look at the tooth eruption pattern, and to see what teeth had erupted and compare that to what we see in, let's say, Neanderthals. And Tanya Smith and colleagues figured out that this individual grew slow. And slow growth is one of the hallmarks of being a modern human. We have a very extended adolescent period, juvenile period, before we reach maturity, and we're very unusual compared to great apes in that aspect. And so this suggested that this modern human pattern of tooth growth was present in this individual from Jebel Irhoud, and I'm going to come back to that later. The other news from this was also by looking at the broken tooth enamel, they were able to date this specimen directly, and they came up with a date of about 160,000 years. So this made it then one of the oldest modern humans in Africa. Now, getting back to that fossil pay dirt that I said, this happened in 2007, and it was the result of very careful excavations that uncovered a skull and a lot of other material representing other parts of the skeleton. So here is where the new fossils were found. I'm going to show you a number of slides of the excavation. Here, if you look very carefully, you can see bits and pieces of the skull. Here, coming out of the ground, is a maxilla. There's a better picture here of the teeth. This is the lower jaw that was found. But in the end, the material was very, very fragmentary, and there's only so far you can go in the field. And so they covered it in plaster, and they dug out a big section of the rock in which it was encased, and they were able to take it back to the lab in Rabat in order to study it more carefully and very slowly. So here's Abdullah and Jean-Jacques with that cast after it's been taken out of the ground. And all in total now, coming out of this site, as of 2007, we have 22 human fossils with a minimum number of individuals of 5, so there's at least 5 individuals here. In 2007, we had the cranium, mandible, teeth, humerus. This is the upper arm bone, upper leg bone, the femur, some lumbar vertebrae, your lower back. And even since then, more material has been found: ribs, fibula, maxilla, cervical vertebrae, and more teeth. So it's quite a find indeed. And what this image is showing you here on the left is the virtual reconstruction we were able to do using these very sophisticated techniques, using micro-CT, and even though there was a very broken up skull, you can see here, using these techniques, you can virtually take pieces apart and put them back together, mirror image the parts that you're missing, and basically get a very nice and very accurate representation of the material. So this is the virtual reality lab at the Max Planck Institute. This is our Brakeman scanner that's used to do surface scans. The micro-CT scanner is much bigger. It's in a different room. The micro-CT allows you to actually look at bone structure and tooth structure. And here, here's an image of the jaw, Irhoud 11. And so, as I mentioned, these fossils were taken out of the ground and brought to Rabat. But by this time, I left Leipzig in 2006 and moved to New York City to become a professor at New York University. And so I did not fly back to Rabat to look at these fossils. I didn't have to. Because of this great technology and because they were able to build 3D models like this, they sent me the files virtually. And in fact, it's almost better to do it this way because I can zoom in using software and look very closely at the morphology of the teeth and even the underlying morphology underneath the tooth enamel, which you never would be able to do just with your bare eyes. And here is, I'm going to load up an image of this skull. I'm hoping it's going to, it worked earlier, so just give me a second, though. It's a big, big, big file. So here's the 3D reconstruction of the skull. Now, with this technology, you can virtually remove the skull on one side if you want, as I'm doing here. And then you can have the computer algorithm fill it in, and you get a very accurate representation of the brain, and you can get an accurate estimate of the brain volume. And the technique also allows us to look, as I mentioned, look underneath the tooth enamel. This is a tooth here with the enamel. Enamel is the white part you see when you smile. And for example, on this tooth, this right down here looks like there might be an extra cusp there, but once you take the enamel off and look at the underlying dentine surface, it's very clear that that cusp does not exist. And so this technology, again, allows us to get a much more accurate picture of not only the skull, but also of the dental morphology. So that brings us to the diagnosis. So I studied at Arizona State University, and my original work was on the dental morphology of modern humans, of recent humans. And when I talk about dental morphology, or when I use the word dental morphology, what I mean are the bumps and grooves that you see on the teeth. Work by Christy Turner and other people Christy Turner was at Arizona State University, he was my mentor, but other people, work by other people as well, have long showed that there are different dental patterns in different people around the world. So for example, in people who have European ancestry tend to have a high frequency of this cusp here called the Carabelli's cusp. It's on your upper molar, which is your chewing teeth, on the tongue side. So if you ran your tongue along it, you would feel it if you had a big one. People with their ancestry in sub-Saharan Africa have a higher frequency of this cusp here, outlined by this triangle. This is a cusp 7. People who have their ancestry in Northeast Asia tend to have ridges on the tongue side of their incisors, these teeth you see when we smile. They also sometimes have ridges on the outside or on the lip surface of their incisors, together with other traits as well. And what's really cool is that the dental morphology of Native Americans links them very well with Northeast Asians. And so even before we were able to collect DNA from specimens, the dental morphology was telling us that Native Americans have their origin in Northeast Asia. And the DNA has subsequently supported that. Right, they also have shoveling, these lingual surfaces, these ridges on the tongue surface of the teeth. Some of them have double shoveling and other features going on. And there's a pattern also in Australia of dental morphology. Nobody has articulated it yet. It still needs to be done, but they have all sorts of interesting things going on. But basically, if you look at the bumps and grooves that are present on modern humans, you can find these same bumps and grooves and things on fossil humans as well. And so after I completed my master's thesis, I decided to go on and complete my PhD by applying these methods to fossil hominids. And specifically, I was interested in looking at the question of modern human origins, whether we had a single origin in Africa spread out around the world and replaced other people, or whether modern humans evolved in multiple places around the world at about the same time. Because back in the mid-90s, that was the question to answer. The out-of-Africa hypothesis hadn't been proven like it has today with the genetic information. And so I moved on and I looked at Neanderthal teeth and to see if there was continuity between Neanderthals who live in Europe and lived in Europe and parts of West Asia and Europeans. There isn't. But before I get to that, if you would just bear with me for a couple minutes while I walk you through Neanderthal teeth 101. So just some basics of what differentiates Neanderthals from modern humans. And this is going to become important when we're talking about diagnosis and diagnosing these fossils, these recent fossils. So for one thing, Neanderthal incisors, these teeth, again, that we see when we smile, are very curved. They tend to have big bumps or tubercles on the tongue side, and they have that shovel shaping, the ridges on the tongue side as well. And this occurs together. So all Neanderthal incisors have all three of these characteristics. Now, sometimes modern humans have some of these characteristics. Northeast Asians have these tongue ridges on the tongue surface, but they don't have all three of them in combination. So this is actually a Homo sapiens. It's about 25,000 years old from the Upper Paleolithic. It's got some little bit of ridging, but it doesn't have the curvature and it doesn't have the tubercles. The upper molar, again, your chewing tooth, is very distinctive in Neanderthals. It has a very skewed shape, which I've endeavored to quantify by drawing lines between the cusps and making an occlusal polygon, you can see right here, which is a different shape than the one you see in modern humans. In modern humans, it's very wide down here, and in Neanderthals, it's very narrow down here. And also the area itself is relatively smaller in Neanderthals when you compare it to the area of the tooth, which indicates that the cusp tips are oriented more internally. On the lower teeth, the lower second premolar, your dentist calls it your bicuspid, is very unusual in Neanderthals. There's a big ridge here connecting the cheek, the cusp on the cheek side with the cusp on the tongue side. There's multiple tubercles. It's very asymmetrical rather than being round. Here's one in Homo sapiens. You can see it's missing that ridge. And in fact, if I put two little dots here, you'd kind of have a smiling face looking at you, right? And that's a very distinctly modern human characteristic that you don't see outside of modern humans. On the lower molars, there's this ridge here we call middle trigonid crest. That's present in all Neanderthal lower molars, whether you're looking at the wisdom tooth, the second or the first molar, and in modern humans, it's a very, very low frequency. So that's just some of the characteristics. There's more, but you get the idea, I think, that we can definitely tell the difference between Neanderthals and modern humans. And these differences are so distinctive that if you gave me a single tooth, one of these teeth, I could tell you based on a single tooth whether you're looking at a Neanderthal or Homo sapiens. Okay, they're very, very diagnostic. So what do we see when we look at the Jebel Irhoud material? They're very clearly modern, even though they do have they don't have the smiley face, but they don't have this ridge here that we saw in Neanderthals either. And they're not as asymmetrical. The premolar isn't as asymmetrical. And the lower molar lacks this crest, as I showed you in the previous slide. And the upper molars are not skewed the way Neanderthal molars are. Now that tells us they're not Neanderthals, but it doesn't necessarily tell us they're absolutely Homo sapiens. So we went another step with the teeth and looked at the underlying dentine surface. This was work done by my colleague Matt Skinner, and we looked at the shape of the tooth. And just, I tried to take most of the graph. I did take most of the graphs out, but this is the one you have to look at. So these are upper molar shapes, and these are Neanderthals, and you can see it has a very skewed shape. These are modern humans that are much more square. And these are guys that are in between. These are archaic Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, or some early modern humans that fall in here. And Jebel Irhoud, they're all the way over here. Okay, so they're not even close. They're not even with these other archaic groups. They're very, very, very modern looking. And the same we can say the same thing of the lower molar shape as well, based on the underlying surface, the surface underlying the tooth enamel. So you'll have to trust me on that because I took that graph out. Everybody likes faces, right? So everybody likes skulls. So I'll tell you a little bit about the skulls as well, even though this wasn't my work specifically. But what's interesting about the Jebel Irhoud material is the face is very, very modern looking. Now they did a number of reconstructions. That's what all these stars represent, because when you're using virtual reconstructions, you can move things around. They could change around a little bit. So they did multiple reconstructions, and every time you can see these reconstructions of the face, and we're talking about this part of the skull here, fall well within recent, not just modern humans, but recent modern humans. So they're very, very modern looking. Neanderthals are out here. Here's Middle Pleistocene Homo. All right, they all have primitive faces that kind of jut forward. So this is a flat face. It doesn't have, the face is oriented along the coronal line, so this way, rather than having a face that's rather pulled forward like you see in Neanderthals. And this is interesting because it contrasts with the shape of the skull and the neurocranium, or the brain, which in Jebel Irhoud is rather primitive looking. Okay, so here's modern humans, here's Homo erectus, here's some Neanderthals, and Jebel Irhoud. The two skulls that we have are falling somewhere in between. Okay, so they're not falling with anything in particular, but they're somewhere in between all three of these. So that suggests, and you can tell by the shape of it too, this is actually a very high forehead, but it's a little bit elongated, and it's primitive in that respect. And their brow ridges on one of the skulls are rather large as well. So there's primitive aspects to the skull as well, but the face is very, very modern. So that brings us to our interpretation. So before the redating of the Jebel Irhoud material, we had modern humans from a number of sites in Africa dating to somewhere between 160,000 years and 190,000 years, or close to 200,000 years. But they were all from East Africa. And there's one skull down in South Africa. It's a partial skull. People weren't paying so much attention to it, but now people are paying attention to it because we know that modern humans are older than we thought they were. Now, the original dates on the Jebel Irhoud material were based on faunal remains, animal remains. They did some analyses on animal teeth using electron spin resonance, and they came up with dates between 90,000 and 190,000. That's a big range. But as I mentioned, this child's jaw was dated directly using similar methods, actually using uranium methods and ESR, electron spin resonance, and that date came in between 140 and 176. But the new dates for this pushed that back by another 100,000 years at least. And this was really the big news. This was when Jean-Jacques called me up and told me this. I literally had to pick my jaw up off my desk. Because I knew it was modern. It was not, that wasn't surprising to me, but I had no idea that it would be this old. And you might be asking, well, how come if you dated that kid's jaw directly and you got a date 160,000, 170,000, why is this date any more accurate? And good for you for thinking that. The answer is that the date that was made on that juvenile jaw was based on accumulation rate of where they thought it was found. right? And that's why these new finds in 2007 are so important, because they knew exactly where they were found. As you saw that old map, it wasn't all that great. You know, we try our best, but now with this new find found in situ, they could get a much more accurate estimate of the background radiation and the accumulation rate, and therefore this dating is very, very secure. So it pushes it back by 100,000 years, and that was really big news. But then again, why? Why was it such big news, right? Because we know that Neanderthals and modern humans share a common ancestor around 700,000 years ago. So they've been on different evolutionary trajectories for 700,000 years. And we know that there are Neanderthal ancestors in Spain, a site called Cima de los Huesos that dates to about 400,000 years ago, and they are very clearly Neanderthal ancestors. They have Neanderthal face-like stuff going on, and their teeth, these are all upper molars, these are very, very Neanderthal-like. So if we can find pre-Neanderthals, or going back to 400,000 years, why wouldn't we find pre-modern Homo sapiens, right, the ancestors of modern Homo sapiens, dating back 300,000 years? In fact, I would predict that we will find additional fossils that push that back even farther in the future. And now that this barrier has been broken, now there's a lot of places we can look, and I think we're more open to finding those things. So it's pretty phenomenal. And also the big deal is that it was found in North Africa. So before this, we thought of modern human origins as being a single event out of Africa. That's been shown very well by the fossil evidence and by the DNA now for many years. But it was thought that this origin came from East Africa, right? In one spot here, spreading out maybe 65,000 years ago, spreading out and getting to Australia by at least 65,000 years. It's like they were running. Let's go to Australia. And then a subsequent exodus a little bit later going out to Asia, and another one eventually leading to Europe. So there were a number of dispersals, but our models all show them coming out of East Africa. And now we have to reconsider that. We have to consider that, in fact, this is a Pan-African origin. So there is no Garden of Eden, or if there is, if you want to use that Garden of Eden is all of Africa. So there were populations around between 200 and 300,000 years ago that were interbreeding with one another. And through this a gradual process, you get modern humans. And then those humans, of course, spread out, and they when they meet Neanderthals, and then when they meet up with Denisovans, the Denisovans are a recently named group. I don't have a picture of their heads because we don't know what they look like. We have a DNA. They've been identified through DNA from a teeny tiny bit of a pinky bone and about 3 teeth. And they have DNA that differentiates them from Neanderthals and modern humans, but they probably split off from Neanderthals. So they're closer to Neanderthals than modern humans. But we know that when the modern humans left, they mated with the Denisovans and they mated with Neanderthals, because everybody in this room has between 2 and 4% of Neanderthal DNA in them. But they eventually replaced them, obviously, because modern humans are the only ones here. But the other cool thing is, and this is something I was also involved with this summer, is that we finally got dates on these new species, this new species from South Africa called Homo naledi. And that date is 235,000. So what that means is that during this time that Homo sapiens was, we were evolving in Africa, in different parts of Africa, there was a completely different species that actually looked very, very different from us, more different from us than Neanderthals. They were existing at the same time. And we don't know if there was any interaction between modern humans and Homo naledi, because there's no DNA that's been extracted out of Homo naledi yet, but we're still keeping our fingers crossed that we might find something and figure that out. So that's another really interesting enigma. So as I mentioned, we have to think about modern human origins now as a Pan-African event. We've got Jebel Irhoud at 300,000 years, give or take 30,000 years. There's material from Leakey Spring in Kenya that's older than 200,000 years, and then there's material from Florisbad in South Africa that's dated to around 260. So we have the fossils that suggest that this process is going on. And what's interesting, let me back up 1 second. This map is showing that in this time period, around 300,000 years ago, there was no barrier between North Africa, East Africa, and South Africa. So there was no Sahara Desert. It was a green area. Okay, so this would have allowed for the intermixing and the movement of populations all around Africa. And when people move and encounter each other, they intermix. That's just what we do. So the other interesting thing is that the oldest Middle Stone Age material, the MSA in Africa, comes from these multiple sites here, all dating to about this same time period. And at one time, we thought these were Homo heidelbergensis or archaic Homo sapiens making these. And now we know that this is probably the artifacts left by our species, by Homo sapiens. And what's interesting is when I showed you that reconstruction of the Jebel Irhoud brain, and when we look at the brain, it is rather primitive. It's rather small for Homo sapiens. And perhaps that's not a coincidence that we find these Middle Stone Age artifacts associated with these earliest Homo sapiens as well. And we don't really see big changes in the artifacts until later on. So there might have been something that's related to brain reorganization or relative brain size that leads to innovations in technology that we see, for example, around 80,000 years ago, things like ochre here that's been etched from Blombos in South Africa, shells that have been perforated and worn either on clothing or as some kind of personal ornament, pendant or something like that, also dating to around 80,000 years ago. Nice blades and these still bay points that are hallmarks that are different from the Middle Stone Age material that you see. Those shell beads were found in other places as well, including Morocco and North Africa. 2 publications here dating them to around 82,000 years ago. So obviously there's connection between groups and they're sharing ideas as well as sharing genes in this modernization process. And outside of Africa, we also get shell beads, similar shell beads, but humans are using these are Middle Paleolithic type tools. And this is a little bit older, 100 to 135,000 years. So you've got some bits and pieces of modern behavior, including these shell beads, and also the people here in Israel at sites Kafsa and Skahul, which are about the same age, between 90 and 100,000 years ago. Some of them were burying their dead. So you have inklings of modern behavior, but not the entire package. And it's not until later that you really see indications of this modern behavior, which suggests then that modern behavior and modern faces or modern skulls, I should say, the complete modern morphological package don't go hand in hand. So just to summarize, we see a mosaic pattern of evolution in Homo sapiens. The face becomes modern before the brain size does and before the brain head shape does. We also are pushing this date back to 300,000 years, which makes it 100,000 years older than we thought before. And the material coming from North Africa suggests that our origins is a Pan-African event rather than occurring in one place only. So I just want to acknowledge that this is very much a collaborative project, and I was just one of many, many people who were looking at the fossils and the tools and the fauna remains. Thank you for your attention.